Something tightened, maybe a few minutes ago, maybe earlier, sir, you might not have noticed. The body rarely announces these things. It just begins. There is a period before anger that most people never think to examine. Not because it doesn't exist, but because it passes so quickly, and what comes after is so much louder. Rage has volume. What lives just beneath it, just before it, that part tends to go unnamed. Welcome to the Sleepy Biologist. I'm glad you're here tonight, genuinely glad. The fact that this space continues to exist is something I think about more than I let on, and that has everything to do with the people who show up for it, who support it, who occasionally leave a comment that quietly makes the whole thing feel worthwhile. Tonight, we're going to begin very gently. No urgency. The biology here is worth taking slowly. Before the shout, before the clench, before you even knew what you were feeling, your nervous system already knew. That's where we're starting. The amygdala doesn't wait for context. That's worth sitting with for a moment, actually. It's one of those facts that sounds tidy when you first hear it, and then slowly becomes stranger the longer you hold it. The structure, small almond-shaped, buried deep inside each temporal lobe. It processes incoming signals from your senses faster than the prefrontal cortex can begin to sort them. This is not a flaw in the design. It was extraordinarily useful in environments where hesitation had consequences. But here is what that same system does in the present. In an ordinary room, in the middle of an ordinary evening, something happens, words from someone, a silence where there should have been sound, a message that came too late or didn't come at all. The amygdala flags it. The flagging triggers a cascade. Adrenal glands receive a signal. The sympathetic nervous system begins warming up. The body leans forward, chemically, before any conscious thought has formed. And somewhere in that interval, that slice of a second, there is feeling. Not yet anger, something softer and more honest. Hurt, possibly, or fear wearing a face you didn't recognize, or grief that hadn't found its name yet. Sometimes the initial signal is simply the raw sensation of mattering too much, of caring about something more than you realized, and being reminded of that suddenly. The body receives all of these as threat signals, different causes, same biological pathway. This is what makes anger so disorienting later. Not the anger itself, that part eventually makes sense, but the fact that it arrived as a replacement. Something else was there first, and then it wasn't. The nervous system chose the response that felt more still, more armoured. You've probably felt this. The sharp edge of an argument that started with something tender underneath it. The outburst that surprised even you. There's a reason the surprise is genuine. By the time anger surfaces, the original feeling has already been rerouted. Even from yourself. The hypothalamus helps coordinate the physical side of this. It integrates signals from the amygdala and begins calibrating physiological response, heart rate, blood pressure, muscle tone. It's not interested in whether the incoming signal was grief or danger. It's interested in preparing the body for whatever comes next. Preparation looks the same for a while, regardless of what triggered it. There is something almost sad about that. I'm not sure sad is the right word. Strange, maybe. The biology of protection and the biology of pain share so much circuitry that they can swap places, and the mind watches from a step behind, trying to catch up. Your jaw may hold something your chest won't say. The hands know things, the voice doesn't. Not metaphorically. The musculature involved in bracing, in tensing, in readying, it responds to emotional signals through the same motor pathways that prepare the body for physical effort. This is real. This is happening in real tissue. The body was registering something before you had language for it. It registered something and it made a choice, not a conscious one, not a moral one, a very old, very fast chemical choice to take whatever was fragile and place it somewhere less visible, to put something harder in front of it. Anger has a surface, hurt doesn't as easily. So you're here now. The day is behind you. Whatever it held, arguments, silences, things left unfinished, the body is still carrying some of it. It doesn't clock out the way the rest of you does. But here is what's also true. The same system that created all of that, the rapid-fire amygdala responses, the sympathetic activation, the rerouting of pain into something with sharper edges, that same system is capable of quieting. Slowly. It requires certain conditions, a reduction in perceived threat, a shift in the signals arriving from the body's periphery, breathing, which actually does matter, not as an instruction, just as a fact. Slower, shallower breathing reduces the input stream. The nervous system adjusts its estimates. The body is doing this now, as you lie still. Some of the tension from earlier, not all of it, but some, is already beginning to disperse. The chemistry that was raised in response to whatever happened today is beginning incrementally to lower. The original feeling is still somewhere in there, maybe, unarmored, under the surface of everything that covered it. It doesn't know. That's the thing, and it took me a while to really let that land. For all the authority the amygdala seems to have over how we feel and what we do next, it operates in certain critical moments without the capacity for the kind of discrimination we assume it must have. Two signals arrive. One is danger, one is pain, and from where it sits, deep inside the medial temporal lobe, they can look identical, not similar. Identical. The amygdala is not one thing precisely. It's a collection of nuclei, the basal, the lateral, the central, a few others, folded together into a structure roughly the size and shape of a small almond, one on each side of the brain, sitting just ahead of the hippocampus. What it does, among several things, is evaluate incoming sensory information for emotional relevance. This sounds passive when you describe it that way, like a filter. But the evaluation is active, fast, and very often takes place before the cortex has had time to weigh in with anything resembling context. The lateral nucleus receives input first. Signals come in from the thalamus, and this is the part that has always struck me as quietly remarkable. They arrive via two separate routes. One pathway goes through the thalamus directly to the amygdala, bypassing the cortex entirely. It's shorter, faster, and doesn't stop to gather detail. The other pathway takes the longer route through sensory cortices, where the signal gets processed more thoroughly before the amygdala sees it. Joseph Ledoux, who spent decades mapping this, called the first route the low road and the second the high road. The low road wins on speed by a significant margin. The high road wins on accuracy. In a situation of genuine physical threat, this arrangement is close to perfect. You flinch before you've identified what startled you. Your heart rate climbs before you've named the fear. But grief doesn't trigger the thalamus the same way a sudden sound does. Grief is slower. It builds. It arrives dressed in ordinary sensations, a heaviness in the chest, a kind of pressure behind the eyes, a flatness that settles over a few hours without being traceable to any single moment. And yet, at some threshold, these signals reach the amygdala, and the amygdala does something that the cortex would not necessarily do if given more time. It treats them as threat. The central nucleus of the amygdala is where the output lives. Once a signal has been evaluated and flagged, the central nucleus initiates a response, and the responses it has available are not finely calibrated for the source of the problem. It communicates with the hypothalamus, which will then activate the sympathetic nervous system. It signals the brainstem, which will modulate arousal and attention. It influences the release of stress hormones. All of this happens, the whole cascade, whether the incoming signal was a predator or a memory of something that happened 3 years ago that you haven't fully finished feeling. There is something genuinely strange about that, I think. Not wrong, strange. The system was built for an environment that had fewer categories of pain. Survival required distinguishing between food and predator, safe and unsafe, kin and stranger. It did not need to distinguish between the particular ache of being misunderstood and the particular ache of physical danger. Those were, in most conditions that shaped us, the same problem. Being rejected by your social group, in the world this system was designed for, was not emotionally unpleasant in the way that being picked last for something is emotionally unpleasant today. It was dangerous, potentially fatal. So the amygdala learned no such distinction, and it has not, in the intervening time, had reason to update. What this means, in practical cellular terms, is that when you feel something painful enough, the amygdala activates similarly regardless of what caused it. Neuroimaging research has shown that social pain and physical pain share overlapping neural substrates, including activation in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, regions involved in the affective, unpleasant dimension of physical pain. This overlap is not decorative. It reflects something real about how the brain represents suffering, not as a categorized library of distinct emotional types, but as a graded signal of something is wrong. When the signal reaches a certain intensity, the amygdala doesn't pause to ask whether this is the kind of something is wrong that requires defense, or the kind that requires sitting down quietly and letting yourself feel it. It picks defense, every time. The extended metaphor I keep returning to when I think about this is a very old security system, the kind installed so long ago that the distinction between an intruder and a heavy wind had never been programmed in. It flags both. It sounds both alarms. And because it can't know which is which, it defaults to the response that costs more but feels safer. Better to mobilize unnecessarily than to remain still when stillness is wrong. But unlike an old security system, you can't call the company. You can't update the firmware. The architecture is fixed in ways that matter. What isn't fixed is the layer above it. The prefrontal cortex, which receives input from the amygdala and can, under the right conditions, modulate its response. This modulation is slow, is effortful. It requires a level of resource, cognitive, physiological, that diminishes when a person is already depleted, already stressed, already running on whatever remains at the end of a long day, which is why, by evening, the amygdala's influence tends to feel stronger, not because something has changed in the structure itself, but because the systems that balance it have less left to work with. You're lying still now. The room is probably quiet. The body is beginning to redistribute its attention away from the external world and inward, which is what it does when a certain kind of safety is established, not declared, just sensed. The amygdala is still there, of course. It doesn't switch off, but its evaluation of the present environment is receiving less alarming input than it was a few hours ago. There is something that you felt today that might not have been fully processed. A signal that arrived and got rerouted. The amygdala saw something painful and handed it to the stress response, because that was the only tool it had. The original thing is still somewhere in the system. Quieter now, though, under the surface of whatever the day became. Your jaw right now, not doing anything with it, just noticing. Whether it's resting loosely or whether there's a faint pressure there, a held quality, something that's been sitting in that position for longer than you chose. Most people, when they check, find something. A tightness they didn't decide to create. The masseter muscle is one of the strongest in the body relative to its size. It closes the jaw, it holds. And when the nervous system has been running a stress response, even a mild one, even one that's been running so quietly you stop noticing it, the masseter receives signals to maintain some degree of contraction, not to bite, not to chew, just to hold, to stay ready. The body, not wanting to be caught unprepared, keeps certain muscles on a low, persistent simmer. You didn't ask it to do that. It did it because something happened, and the something was logged, and the log hasn't been cleared yet. The diaphragm is similar, though harder to notice. It sits at the base of the chest, and under emotional load it tends to tighten, not fully, not dramatically, but enough to shorten the breath without the shortening ever quite becoming conscious. The breath becomes a little more chest-based, a little more effortful, a little more contained. This feeds back into the stress system. Shallow breathing is itself a signal. The body reads its own posture and draws conclusions. It's a loop, a small one usually, quiet, but it runs. And the hands. I find the hands particularly interesting for some reason. There's something specific about what happens to the hands when a person is suppressing something. The slight curling, the pressure in the palms, the tendency to press fingertips together or close them inward. These aren't gestures. They are partial preparations, the motor system initiating something and then stopping partway through, holding the intention without completing it. A body about to do something it was not allowed to do. The muscles involved in grip and in striking share circuitry with the emotional suppression response in ways that are still being traced. What's clear is that the signal went somewhere physical. The feeling didn't stay abstract. It found tissue. Fascia is worth mentioning here, not because of anything mystical which sometimes gets attached to it, but because of what it actually does. It's connective tissue. Dense, fibrous, continuous through the body in a way that means tension in one region pulls on adjacent regions. The jaw connects through fascial planes to the throat to the chest to the diaphragm. When a person holds tension in the jaw for hours, the fascial network carries some of that load downward. This is not subtle under a microscope. The tissue shows it. There is a cost to containment that the body pays quietly and over time. Chronically elevated muscle tone in response to suppressed emotional states increases metabolic demand in those tissues. The cells require more oxygen. The local circulation adjusts. Over days, weeks, longer, the pattern becomes something the body considers default. Not injury, not disease, but a baseline that sits slightly higher than it needed to. The body held something, and the holding left a shape. What's strange is how ordinary this all becomes. The tight jaw doesn't announce itself after a while. The shallow breath doesn't feel shallow because it becomes the breath you know. The body normalizes the tension so completely that relaxation, when it happens, can feel almost unfamiliar. A loosening that takes a moment to recognize as release rather than loss of control, night, lying still. The muscles don't have much to prepare for. The jaw can soften, not because anything was resolved and nothing needs to be resolved tonight, but because the signals that were arriving have quieted and the tissue no longer needs to wait. The holding was real, so is this. The thing that surprises most people when they first encounter this is the timing. Not that cortisol's involved in emotional pain. That part, once you hear it, feels almost obvious. But how early it arrives. Before the feeling has a name, before it has even fully formed into something you'd call a feeling. The hormonal response to emotional distress can precede conscious awareness of that distress by a measurable interval. The body knew something was wrong. It started responding. And you caught up later, in the way you always do. Cortisol is synthesized in the adrenal cortex, the outer layer of two small glands sitting just above the kidneys, and its release is governed by a chain of signals that begins, often, in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, which travels to the anterior pituitary, which releases adrenocorticotropic hormone into the bloodstream, which then reaches the adrenal cortex and prompts cortisol production. This cascade, called the HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal heaven, takes somewhere between 15 minutes and an hour to produce a measurable rise in cortisol levels depending on the intensity and nature of the stressor. 15 minutes minimum, which means that if you felt a sharp emotional pain at 8 in the evening, a conversation that landed badly, a silence that carried more weight than silence should, your cortisol was climbing before you decided how to feel about it. The function of cortisol in acute stress is, in basic terms, mobilization. It increases the availability of glucose in the bloodstream by promoting gluconeogenesis in the liver. Essentially, it tells the body to make more fuel available. It modulates immune function. It reduces processes the body considers non-urgent, digestion, certain aspects of tissue repair, reproductive function, to redirect resources toward whatever the system has classified as an immediate demand. It heightens alertness through effects on the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. All of this makes excellent sense in the context for which the system was designed. Cortisol is not confused when it does these things in response to physical threat. It is doing exactly what it should do. What it cannot do, what it has no mechanism for, is assess whether the threat is something you can outrun. Grief doesn't move. It doesn't have a location. You cannot place yourself at a safe distance from a feeling. But cortisol doesn't know this. It prepares the body as if distance were possible, as if effort would help. The glucose floods the blood. The inflammation response shifts. The digestive system quiets. And you sit in a room feeling vaguely wired and hollow at the same time, which is exactly what a body in a state of preparation feels like when there is nowhere to run to. There's something else cortisol does that I find harder to explain cleanly, because the research here is still being refined, but it's worth sitting with. It affects the retrieval and consolidation of emotional memories in ways that are not straightforwardly negative or positive. They're selective. High cortisol levels tend to enhance the encoding of emotionally significant experiences while simultaneously impairing some aspects of prefrontal function, including the kind of reflective, contextualizing thinking that would help you place an experience in perspective. So on a night when something painful happened and the HPA axis is running, you are both more likely to form a strong memory of the painful thing and less equipped to reason your way around it. The feeling becomes more. The tools to manage it become less. This is not a design flaw exactly. In acute danger, you want to remember the threat clearly. You want the memory sharp. The cost, the reduced perspective, the narrowed thinking, is acceptable in an environment where survival depends on remembering what almost killed you, not on nuanced emotional processing. But you are not in that environment, and the cortisol doesn't know that. Adrenaline, epinephrine, arrives faster, released directly from the adrenal medulla within seconds of a perceived threat, and its effects are briefer. Heart rate, peripheral vasoconstriction, pupil dilation, the body's version of an immediate alert. Cortisol follows behind, slower, longer lasting, like the second wave of something the first wave started. Together, in the context of emotional pain rather than physical danger, they create a physiological state that maps very precisely onto what anger feels like from the inside. Elevated heart rate, heightened arousal, increased metabolic activity, muscles with more available fuel than they need for simply sitting still. Anger feels this way because it is this way, physically. The chemistry of preparation and the chemistry of rage are nearly indistinguishable at the level of hormones and tissue. And here is the part that I keep returning to being what the body does when it's been running this preparation response for a while without any appropriate outlet, is begin nudging perception and behavior in the direction of the emotion that makes most physiological sense. You are primed. The body has spent real metabolic resources getting you to a state of readiness. Something inside the system looks at all that preparation and decides it should be used. Anger is use. Grief just sits there. Grief doesn't spend the cortisol. Grief doesn't explain the elevated glucose. From the body's perspective, if we can speak loosely of perspective, anger is a more coherent response to the chemical state than sadness is. There's a concept in effective neuroscience sometimes described as the constructed nature of emotion. The idea, associated with researchers like Lisa Feldman Barrett, that emotions aren't hardwired programs that get triggered by the right conditions, but are instead the brain's best predictions about what's happening inside the body and why. The brain receives interoceptive signals, information about the body's internal state, and generates an emotional interpretation that best accounts for that information in context. When the internal state is high arousal, elevated cortisol, sympathetic activation, the brain has several possible interpretations available. Excitement, fear, anger. The choice between them is partly contextual, partly historical, and partly a function of whatever emotional vocabulary the person has developed for states like this. For many people in many situations, the interpretation of this particular cluster of signals, the tightness, the heat, the elevated heartbeat, the restless, unusable energy, is anger. Not because anger is the correct feeling, but because the body is producing a signature that anger knows how to wear. The half-life of cortisol in the blood is approximately 60 to 90 minutes, though the effects on target tissues can persist longer. Adrenaline clears faster within minutes. What this means practically is that the physiological priming that began in response to something emotional several hours ago is most likely still present, diminished but present as you lie here now. Your body spent something today, on whatever it was, on the preparation it initiated before you knew you needed it, on the sustained low arousal of processing something that didn't resolve cleanly, on the small repeated stress of whatever the day carried. The cortisol is clearing, not gone. Clearing. The system is winding back towards something quieter, because the signals arriving at the hypothalamus are now calmer, because the environment has changed, because the body reads darkness and stillness and horizontal as safety indicators even without being told to. The grief, or whatever it actually was, underneath the anger, underneath the preparation, doesn't need to be named tonight. The body already knew about it. It's been responding to it for hours. You know the feeling, that particular exposure, standing in a conversation where something true about you is suddenly visible. The chest does something. The throat narrows slightly without your instruction. The skin along the forearms may cool or prickle or both. None of this is symbolic. The anterior insula processes the body's internal state, temperature, pain, hunger, the particular pressure of a full breath, and it also, in the same tissue, processes the physical sensation of emotional exposure, not as metaphor, as signal. The same region that registers mild physical discomfort registers the feeling of being seen in a way you weren't prepared for. This is why vulnerability has a location. It isn't everywhere. It tends to be central, chest, throat, stomach. These are the regions with the densest interoceptive representation in the insula. the places the brain listens to most carefully when it's trying to understand what the body is experiencing. When you feel exposed, the brain is receiving genuine physiological input from these regions and classifying it as threat adjacent. Not identical to threat, but close enough that the autonomic response begins to shift. The skin is part of this in ways that still feel strange to me. Cutaneous blood flow changes under emotional exposure. The same neural pathways that regulate thermoregulation also respond to social and emotional context. The warmth you feel when praised, the coolness when embarrassed, these aren't figures of speech. The skin is genuinely changing temperature. The blood is moving differently. Exposure has a temperature. That phrase isn't poetry, it's peripheral vasoconstriction. It's the autonomic nervous system doing what it does when the brain has flagged something as requiring a response, even a mild one. The throat narrowing is laryngeal. The muscles surrounding the larynx receive efferent signals from the vagus nerve, and under emotional stress, particularly the kind involving suppressed speech, things not said, feelings not named aloud, those muscles can partially contract without the act of swallowing or speaking. The tightness you feel there during vulnerability is not the body being poetic about silence. It is the body preparing for speech it may not give. Something was going to be said. The system got ready. And then the moment passed, or the safety wasn't there, and the preparation stayed without the release. What all of this means is that feeling emotionally open is not a psychological event that happens to have physical correlates. The physical state comes first or alongside. The biology doesn't wait for the interpretation. The insula fires, the skin shifts, the throat tightens, and then, half a second later or less, the experience you call vulnerability assembles itself from those signals. You felt it in the body before you named it in the mind. Most things work this way. Vulnerability just makes it harder to pretend otherwise. Lying still now, the exposure of earlier today has less material to work with. The room is private. Nothing is being asked of you. The insula is still receiving input. It never stops. But the input is quieter, more neutral, the ordinary hum of a body at rest rather than the sharper register of being known by someone unexpectedly. The chest is still, or almost still. The body keeps a small record of the day, and it doesn't erase quickly, but it softens. There is a particular quality to the moment just after something goes wrong. Not the moment itself, the one after. The silence, or the door closing, or the drive home with the radio off. Something in you has already shifted. You can feel it in the chest, in the slightly elevated breath, in the jaw doing that thing again. But what you may not have noticed is that the shift happened in 2 stages, not one, and the second stage, the one that determined which feeling would win, occurred entirely without your involvement. The autonomic nervous system does not consult you. In its resting state, the body maintains what's called autonomic balance, a dynamic equilibrium between the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches that keeps the heart at a comfortable rate, the digestion moving, the breath loose and low. The parasympathetic branch, mediated largely through the vagus nerve, is sometimes simplified as the rest and digest system, though that phrase undersells how active it actually is. It isn't passive, it is constantly doing something, modulating cardiac output, managing inflammatory responses, maintaining the physiological conditions under which genuine calm is possible. When something emotionally significant happens, that balance tips. The tipping is fast. Sympathetic activation can alter heart rate within 1 to 5 seconds through direct neural pathways, not hormonal, not requiring any chemicals travel anywhere, just a direct signal running down nerve fibers to the sinoatrial node of the heart. The heart speeds up, Peripheral blood vessels constrict or dilate depending on which branch is gaining ground. The body moves into a different register. What it doesn't do is stop to choose which feeling to inhabit. Here's what I find quietly arresting about this. Anger and grief as physiological states are not identical. They have measurably different autonomic profiles. Anger is associated with relatively higher heart rate, increased cardiac output, and particular patterns of peripheral vasodilation. The face flushes, the hands warm, the body prepares for approach rather than withdrawal. Grief and states of sadness more broadly tend to show a different pattern. Increased parasympathetic tone in some phases, slower heart rate, the particular heaviness in the limbs that comes from a body not preparing to do anything but not resting either. Two distinct physiological signatures. What the research suggests, and this is the part that takes a moment to absorb, is that the body doesn't simply react and then label the reaction. It also runs the process in the other direction. The physiological state shapes the emotional interpretation. A body in a state of sympathetic activation, with elevated heart rate and warm hands and heightened arousal, is a body that will more readily interpret ambiguous information as anger relevant. The state creates a kind of receptivity. The costume once put on starts to feel like skin. The vagus nerve is worth pausing on here. It is the longest cranial nerve in the body, running from the brainstem down through the neck, into the chest, around the heart and lungs, continuing into the abdomen. It carries information in both directions. 80% of its fibers are afferent, meaning they carry signals upward from the body to the brain, not downward. The brain is, in a very real sense, listening to the body more than it is instructing it. When vagal tone is high, when the parasympathetic system has strong rhythmic influence over cardiac function, emotional regulation is easier. The system has more flexibility. It can brake. When vagal tone is low, or when it has been withdrawn in response to a perceived threat, the braking capacity diminishes. What's left is the unmodulated sympathetic signal, the preparation, the arousal, the body leaning forward into whatever comes next. Grief requires a kind of stillness the body may not currently be able to provide. Anger doesn't need stillness. Anger fits the arousal state like something tailored for it. There's a study I keep returning to, and I'll be honest, I'm paraphrasing from memory here, so take this loosely, in which participants with experimentally induced high heart rates reported stronger feelings of anger in response to mildly provocative scenarios than participants whose heart rates were lower. The body's arousal level wasn't reflecting the emotion, it was in part generating the conditions for it. The emotion assembled itself around the physiological state rather than the physiological state assembling itself around the emotion. Which is a disorienting thing to sit with. It means that by the time you feel angry, the body has already made several decisions on your behalf. The sympathetic system gained ground, vagal withdrawal occurred, heart rate climbed, and the brain, receiving all of this as interoceptive input, did what it does. It constructed the most coherent emotional interpretation available. The available interpretation was anger. The grief was there. Still is probably, but grief doesn't fit the body's current posture. Right now, lying still, the posture is changing. The parasympathetic system doesn't wait for permission to reassert itself. It moves in when the conditions allow, and horizontal stillness in a quiet room is a condition that allows. Heart rate is lower than it was an hour ago. Vagal tone is recovering. The body is beginning to release whatever posture it was holding. The costume is coming off. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the physiological signature of anger, the readiness, the warmth, the elevated arousal, it has a half-life, and you're somewhere past it now. What's underneath may take a moment to surface, or it may just quietly be there already. Think about what it would have meant in a different kind of environment to show pain. Not the abstract question, but the physical one. What it would have meant for the body's safety, for a person's position within a group, for their probability of surviving the next several hours. In environments where resources were contested and group membership was not guaranteed, and predators were a real category of problem rather than a metaphorical one, the display of vulnerability was information that could be used against the one displaying it. Competitors noted weakness. Hierarchies shifted around injury. To appear wounded was to invite a particular kind of attention that had nothing to do with care. The body learned this, not as a lesson anyone taught it, and not as something that passed through conscious reasoning. It learned it the slow way, across generations, through the differential survival of individuals whose nervous systems happened to manage distress less visibly, who happened to maintain behavioral coherence under conditions that would have caused others to break posture, break ranks, signal their diminishment to whoever was watching. Natural selection is not subtle, but it is thorough. What we're talking about, when we talk about emotional concealment as an evolved behavior, is a feature of the threat response architecture that goes well beyond the individual. Humans are a deeply social species, and that phrase is used so often it has started to feel like furniture, something you walk past without looking at. But what it actually means mechanically is that for most of human evolutionary history, the single most important variable in any given individual's survival was the quality of their relationships within their group, not their strength, not their intelligence in isolation, their embeddedness, their utility to others, their perceived health and competence. A person who could not conceal their suffering was a person who, standing within the group, was perpetually vulnerable to the evidence of that suffering. This is not a harsh or cynical reading of human nature. It is what the social environment selected for over a very long time. The nervous systems that could maintain a functional exterior while processing genuine interior distress were, in many circumstances, the nervous systems that persisted. Their descendants are here. You are in all likelihood one of them. The neural infrastructure for this kind of concealment is real and identifiable. The prefrontal cortex, the lateral and medial regions both, exerts top-down inhibitory control over amygdala output, effectively dampening the behavioral expression of emotional states, while those states remain physiologically active. This is not suppression in the lay sense, where a feeling is pushed down and disappears. The feeling continues, the hormonal cascade continues, the physiological preparation continues. What changes is the motor output, the face, the voice, the posture, which receives regulatory signals that keep it from broadcasting what the interior is doing. The brain is running two programs simultaneously. One processes the pain, the other manages what the pain looks like from the outside. This dual operation is metabolically expensive. It requires prefrontal resources that are themselves subject to depletion. And it requires that the two processes not interfere with each other too badly, that the interior signal stays below the threshold at which it overwhelms the exterior management. When the interior signal is too strong, or when the prefrontal resources are too depleted, the concealment fails, the voice changes, the eyes change, and something leaks through. But most of the time, in most people, the infrastructure holds, because it was built to hold. There is something I keep finding myself thinking about when I sit with this material, which is the question of what happened to the signals that didn't get expressed. If the amygdala fired and the cortisol rose, and the sympathetic system activated, and then all of that was managed into behavioral stillness by the prefrontal cortex, where did the energy go? The physiological preparation didn't disappear because the face remained neutral. The glucose was in the blood, the muscles were ready for something, The body had mobilized resources for a response that wasn't given. The answer, as far as the research suggests, is that the energy redirects. It finds the path that the concealment architecture left open, and often that path is anger. Because anger, as we've touched on before, is physiologically consonant with the aroused state the body is already in. It uses the preparation. It has somewhere to go. It makes sense of the cortisol in a way that sadness or grief or simple acknowledged hurt does not. This is the substitution the chapter title refers to, not a decision, not a coping strategy chosen from a menu. A deeply old rerouting built into the architecture that turns concealed pain into expressed aggression, and does this so efficiently, so automatically, that by the time it has happened, the original pain is no longer accessible. The body substituted, and then it forgot what it had substituted. This pattern shows up with particular consistency in certain developmental contexts, which is worth noting. Children who grow up in environments where emotional vulnerability is unsafe, not dramatically unsafe necessarily, just quietly, consistently penalized, develop stronger habitual activation of the concealment architecture. The prefrontal suppression of amygdala output becomes practiced, more automatic, more reflexive. The threshold at which the rerouting happens lowers, the substitution gets faster. By adulthood, the rerouting occurs before there is any conscious awareness that there was something to reroute. The person doesn't experience themselves as concealing pain. They experience themselves as angry. The original signal is genuinely inaccessible to them, not because it was dishonest, but because the architecture is so practiced that the translation is instantaneous. This isn't pathology. It's extraordinarily efficient software running on hardware that was designed for a different operating environment. The environment changed. The software didn't get the update. Oxytocin is relevant here in a way that doesn't always make it into these conversations. It's most commonly described in the context of bonding and trust, which is accurate but incomplete. Oxytocin also plays a role in the downregulation of threat responses. It modulates amygdala reactivity, reduces cortisol release under social stress, and promotes the kind of physiological settling that happens when genuine safety is perceived within a relationship. In environments where group membership was secure, where the people around you were reliably not going to exploit your visible pain, oxytocin could do its work. But the system is calibrated to the perceived environment. If the signals coming in, through experience, through repeated relational history, suggest that vulnerability leads to exploitation rather than support, oxytocin's moderating influence weakens. The threat system stays elevated. The concealment architecture stays primed. The substitution keeps running because the conditions that would allow the original feeling to surface safely never quite arrive. Some people carry this for decades without knowing the name of what they're carrying. There's a dull ache in recognizing this, not a dramatic one. Just the particular weight of understanding that a significant portion of what you do, what any of us do, when we feel threatened or hurt or quietly diminished, was not really chosen. It was inherited, refined over thousands of years of social pressure and hierarchical living, and the very practical problem of surviving in groups while remaining individually intact. The anger that surfaces when something tender gets touched, that isn't weakness in disguise. It isn't even primarily a personal history, though personal history shapes the threshold. It is, at its deepest root, an ancient solution to an ancient problem. The problem of being soft-bodied and social in an environment that punished softness. You're not doing something wrong when this happens. You are doing something very, very old. The script keeps running because no one sent the signal that it could stop. That's the plain version of it. The nervous system is still watching for conditions that no longer exist, still maintaining an architecture that was built for a world it hasn't lived in for a very long time. It waits, with a patience that has nothing to do with patience, for the environment to become unsafe. And in the waiting, it holds certain shapes, certain postures, certain routes through pain that lead reliably and quickly away from pain's surface and towards something that moves. Tonight the environment is not unsafe. The body is beginning, slowly, the way all biological things move when they are not being hurried, to register that. The ancient logic is still there. It doesn't leave, but tonight it has less work to do. Testosterone has a reputation problem. Not scientifically, the science is more careful than the reputation. But culturally it has been flattened into something simple. Aggression, dominance, a kind of blunt biological force. The actual molecule is considerably less tidy than that. What testosterone does, in the context of social and emotional experience, is modulate the response to threat and status. It rises in anticipation of competition. It rises after perceived disrespect. It interacts with cortisol in ways that shift depending on which of the two is higher. High testosterone with low cortisol tends toward confident approach behavior, while high testosterone with high cortisol produces something more defensive, more reactive, more brittle around the edges. That second combination, the brittle one, that's closer to what happens when pain has been swallowed and the body is still running a stress response and something small tips the balance. Prolactin is less discussed in this context, which is interesting because its profile is relevant in ways that don't get much popular attention. It's primarily associated with lactation, which is accurate and also radically incomplete as a description. Prolactin is secreted from the anterior pituitary in response to stress, to physical contacts, to emotional experience, and it has inhibitory relationships with dopamine, meaning elevated prolactin tends to lower dopaminergic tone. Reduced dopamine activity is associated with flattened motivation, reduced pleasure, and a particular kind of heavy, unlocatable sadness. Swallowed, grief has a hormonal texture. Prolactin's part of it, not the whole story, but a thread in the chemistry that most accounts skip over. Here's what I find quietly interesting about these two hormones sitting in the same chapter. They seem like opposites. Testosterone with its associations of heat and forward motion, prolactin with its softer, more interior profile. But both of them shift under conditions of suppressed emotional pain. Both of them leave a trace in the blood that the body has to eventually account for. The accounting doesn't always look like what caused it. Elevated testosterone under chronic social stress doesn't stay elevated forever. The HPA axis and the HPG axis, the hormonal systems governing stress and reproduction respectively, interact through feedback loops that eventually dampen each other when activation is sustained for too long. What begins as reactive intensity can become, over weeks and months, a kind of hormonal exhaustion. The anger that ran hot starts running flat. Still present, just different in character. The individual variation here is enormous and worth saying plainly. Baseline hormonal levels differ across people for reasons involving genetics, sleep, nutrition, age, prior stress exposure, relational history, and several other factors that interact in ways researchers are still mapping. The idea that any single hormone determines how a person processes grief or expresses anger is not supported by the evidence. What the evidence does support is that hormonal context shapes the threshold. How quickly the rerouting happens, how long it persists, how much prefrontal resource is required to manage it. Same pain, different chemistry, different outcome. What both testosterone and prolactin know, if we can use that word loosely, almost affectionately, is that something happened. The body changed its chemistry in response to something real. The specific molecules are different. The direction of the change is different. But both of them are, in their way, a record. The body kept receipts. It always does. The chemistry is quieting now as you lie still. Prolactin follows a diurnal rhythm and rises naturally in the hours before sleep. It is, among its many roles, part of what the body does to prepare for rest. Testosterone follows its own daily curve, tending lower in the evening than in the morning. The particular hormonal state you're moving toward right now is not the one that was running earlier today. It's slower, softer at the edges, more willing maybe to let something be felt without immediately converting it into something else. Right now, without moving, see if you can feel your heartbeat. Not by pressing a finger to your wrist, just notice. Whether there's a pulse somewhere in the chest, or the throat, or maybe the temples, whether you can find it without looking for it too hard. Some people find this immediately. Others sit in the question for a while and come up with almost nothing, not because the heart isn't beating, obviously, but because the signal isn't making it through. The pathway from the body's interior to conscious awareness is not a guaranteed route. It has to be built, in some sense, practiced. And in many people, through no particular fault, it was built unevenly. The body generates an enormous amount of information about itself continuously from every organ and tissue and stretch receptor and chemoreceptor it contains. The gut sends signals about its chemical environment. The heart sends information about rhythm and pressure. The lungs report on stretch. The blood vessels communicate temperature and flow. All of this travels upward through neural pathways, primarily the vagus nerve and the spinal cord, toward the brain, where it arrives in a structure called the insula, a fold of cortex buried within the lateral sulcus, tucked beneath the temporal and frontal lobes and largely invisible from the outside of the brain. The posterior insula receives the raw signal. Dense, largely non-conscious, a continuous feed of physiological data. The anterior insula does something different with it. It integrates. It assigns meaning. It takes the raw signal, pressure here, temperature there, a slight shift in cardiac rhythm, and generates what researchers call a global emotional moment, a felt sense of the body's current state. This is where the heartbeat becomes noticeable, where hunger becomes a feeling rather than just a chemical state, where the tightness in the chest that began as stress-related muscle tension becomes, if the process works well, something recognizable as sadness or anxiety, or the particular hollowness that follows an argument. If the process works well, the precision of that translation varies considerably across individuals, and this is where the chapter's real territory begins. Interoceptive accuracy, the degree to which a person's conscious sense of their body's state matches their actual physiological state, has been measured in research settings, most commonly using heartbeat detection tasks where participants try to count their own heartbeats without touching their body. The range of accuracy is wide. Some people are remarkably precise. Others are, genuinely and measurably, much less attuned to what their body is doing. And this isn't simply a matter of attention or effort. The underlying neural architecture differs. Insular volume, insular connectivity, the quality and density of the interoceptive pathways, these vary, shaped by genetics and developmental experience and notably by chronic stress history. People who have spent long periods in states of threat or emotional suppression sometimes show altered interoceptive processing, as if the system learned under conditions where attending to internal pain was itself dangerous to turn the volume down. The interior gets quieter from the inside. The signals keep broadcasting, but the receiver's been adjusted. Here is what this means for anger, practically and physiologically. When a person has low interoceptive accuracy, when the anterior insula is less practiced at translating the body's raw signal into legible felt experience, pain doesn't necessarily disappear. It continues as a physiological state. The cortisol rises, the sympathetic system activates, the body prepares. But the preparation doesn't arrive in consciousness with a clear label attached. It doesn't announce itself as grief or hurt, or the specific tenderness of feeling unseen by someone whose seeing mattered to you. It arrives as arousal, as unspecific activation, as a body that is doing something without the mind knowing quite what or why. And the mind, receiving an activated body with no available explanation for the activation, goes looking for a cause. This is something the brain does automatically. It is uncomfortable in a deep neurological sense to have a physiological state without an interpretation. So the brain generates one. It looks at the environment, recent events, the current social context, and it finds something that could explain the agitation. Usually, it finds something that fits anger better than grief. Grief requires knowing what was lost. Anger only requires finding what was wrong. There's a term, alexithymia, that describes a cluster of characteristics including difficulty identifying and describing one's own emotions, a limited emotional vocabulary, and a tendency toward externally oriented thinking. It's not a disorder exactly, more a dimensional trait that exists on a continuum and is present to some degree in a significant portion of the general population. And its neural correlates involve, predictably, altered insular function and reduced interoceptive awareness. People higher in alexithymia are not emotionally shallow. That's a misunderstanding worth correcting. They feel things. The physiological states are there. The activation is present. The body is doing everything bodies do under emotional load. What's reduced is the translation. The signal exists. The interpretation is missing or misfiring. And without the interpretation, without the felt label, the signal has to go somewhere. It tends to go outward, and it tends to go as something with edges. I've always found this quietly important to sit with. Not because it explains everything about anger, it doesn't, but because it shifts the frame from anger as aggression or character flaw to anger as a body transmitting something it couldn't otherwise say in the only language currently available to it. The insula is, right now, receiving your body's signals. The breath, the weight of the body against the mattress, a particular slightly sinking pressure along the shoulder blades and the heels, whatever cardiac rhythm is running, the temperature of the air on the parts of your skin that aren't covered. These signals are arriving continuously without asking anything of you. Whether they become conscious is another question. Whether they become labelled is another still. But the transmission continues either way. Your body is not quiet inside even when the room is. It is doing several hundred things simultaneously, reporting on all of them, waiting without urgency to see how many get heard. Some of today's signals, the ones that arrive during the harder moments, the ones that activated systems you may not have had words for, are still in there somewhere. Moving through the processing hierarchy, some will surface as feelings tomorrow or next week, arriving with a slight delay the way certain biological things do. Others will just settle, become part of the background that the body carries without announcing. The insula keeps listening, even now as the signals slow down and soften and the body begins the long, unhurried process of deciding it is safe enough, finally, to stop translating quite so hard. Something tightens when it shouldn't. You're somewhere ordinary. A grocery store, a corridor, a particular quality of afternoon light, and a response begins in the body that has no obvious cause. The shoulders draw in slightly, the breath shortens, something in the gut shifts, and when you look for the reason, you find nothing. Nothing recent, nothing here, nothing you'd call a memory. The body remembered something the mind never filed. The hippocampus stores episodic memory, the sequential narrative kind. What happened, when, in what order, with which people. It requires language, or something close to language, to encode properly. It requires a level of cortical development and prefrontal integration that isn't fully present in early childhood and is temporarily reduced under extreme stress. This is why certain experiences, particularly early ones, or ones that arrived with overwhelming intensity, don't leave a story behind. They leave something else. The stress response systems of the body, the HPA axis, the sympathetic nervous system, the amygdala-centered threat circuitry, encode experience through a different mechanism entirely. They don't require narrative. They don't require sequence or language or even conscious attention. What they require is repetition or intensity, or both. When a particular physiological state occurs frequently enough or with enough force, the systems involved begin to treat that state as a baseline expectation rather than a response. The body recalibrates. It adjusts its resting tone, its hormonal set points, its threat detection thresholds to match the environment it has been living in. Not the current environment, the one that did the most shaping. At the cellular level, and this is where it becomes specific in a way that still surprises me slightly every time I return to it, stress experience alters gene expression through epigenetic mechanisms. Epigenetics refers to changes in how genes are read without changes to the underlying DNA sequence itself. Methylation patterns on DNA, modifications to the histone proteins around which DNA is wound, the regulation of which genes are accessible to transcription at any given moment. All of these can be altered by sustained stress exposure. The glucocorticoid receptor gene is one that has been studied extensively in this context. Chronic early stress can reduce the expression of glucocorticoid receptors in the hippocampus, which affects how efficiently the HPA axis shuts itself off after a stress response. The cortisol rises. The feedback loop that would normally say enough, stop now, it's weaker. The response runs longer than it needed to. This is written into the cell, not into the story the cell could tell, into the cell itself. There's a particular texture to this kind of body knowledge that distinguishes it from ordinary stress. Ordinary stress has a traceable cause. Even when it's disproportionate, even when the reaction exceeds what the situation seems to warrant, there's usually a thread you can follow back. This is different. This is a response that arrives without thread. The body reacts with genuine, measurable physiological change, muscle tension, altered breathing, a low-grade cortisol rise, and when the mind searches for the source, it finds a gap where a reason should be. The gap is real. There is no reason in the sense the mind is looking for, but the body isn't operating without cause. It's operating from a record that was kept somewhere the mind doesn't have access to. Fascia holds some of this, as we touched on briefly in an earlier chapter. Connective tissue that maintains the shape of stress patterns long after the acute response has passed. But the more fundamental repository is the nervous system itself. Autonomic tone, the resting balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic activity, is shaped by accumulated history in ways that are not consciously accessible. A person whose early environment was unpredictable often develops a sympathetic system with a lower trigger threshold. Not always. The variability is real and it matters, but the general direction is well supported. The wiring reflects the world it was built in, and it runs in the present as if that world is still here. What the body holds without knowing why, the braced quality in the shoulders that has no event attached to it, the faint nausea in particular social situations that doesn't trace back anywhere clean, the anger that arrives faster than the reason for it. These aren't malfunctions, they are records. Imperfect, non-verbal, sometimes outdated records kept by systems that were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. The body recorded what happened. It just recorded it in a language the mind was never taught to read. You're lying still now, and some of what the body is carrying tonight has no story attached to it. It doesn't need one. The tissue doesn't require a narrative to release. Release, when it comes, is also a physiological process, not a cognitive one. It comes with rest, with sustained safety, with the slow recalibration that happens when the systems that have been holding a particular shape are finally given enough quiet, enough time, enough absence of new threat to begin adjusting their estimate of the world. The body is doing this now, without knowing why, in the same way it held without needing to. Regulation is not a state, it's an activity, and like all activities it draws on something finite, a resource that depletes with use and requires rest to restore, in the same way that muscle draws on glycogen and eventually runs short if the demand is sustained long enough without recovery. The analogy is loose, as most biological analogies are, but the underlying principle is real. The neural systems responsible for inhibiting impulsive responses, for placing emotional experience in context, for choosing one behavior over a more automatic one. These systems are metabolically expensive, and they do not run indefinitely without cost. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the lateral and ventromedial regions, is the primary seat of what researchers call executive function, the cluster of cognitive capacities that includes working memory, cognitive flexibility, inhibitory control, and the ability to weigh future consequences against present urges. It is also, critically, the system that keeps the amygdala from having the last word. Through descending inhibitory pathways, the prefrontal cortex modulates amygdala output, not suppressing it entirely, but providing a counterweight, a checking influence, a way of saying yes, something happened. But here is the broader context, and here is what is actually warranted right now. This checking influence is not free. It costs glucose, it costs oxygen, it costs the sustained electrochemical activity of billions of neurons maintaining a regulatory state against the pull of a faster, older system that would rather just respond. The research literature on ego depletion, the idea that self-regulatory capacity is a limited resource that diminishes with use, has had a complicated history. Early studies suggested that simple acts of self-control could exhaust the capacity for subsequent self-control, and that glucose ingestion could partially restore it. Later replications were inconsistent, and some of the original claims were overstated. What has survived the scrutiny is more nuanced. Regulatory capacity isn't a single tank that empties in a straightforward way, but it is genuinely constrained, genuinely affected by sustained demand, and genuinely reduced under conditions of sleep deprivation, chronic stress, and prolonged emotional load. A long day of managing difficult feelings is, neurologically, a long day of prefrontal activity. By evening, the checking influence is tired, not absent, not broken, just running with less reserve than it had at 9 in the morning, when the first difficult thing hadn't happened yet, and the cortisol was still within its normal diurnal range, and the accumulated weight of the day was still hypothetical. What gets louder when the prefrontal cortex quiets is not simply emotion in the generic sense. It's the older, faster subcortical processing, the amygdala's rapid appraisals, the brainstem's arousal modulation, the automatic behavioral tendencies that don't require cortical oversight to initiate. These systems are not inferior exactly. They're just less interested in nuance. They process faster, categorize more broadly, and respond more readily to signals that pattern match to prior threat experience, even when the match is imperfect. The prefrontal cortex, when it has resources, says, "Wait, let me check this. Let me see whether what just happened is actually what it appears to be. Let me consider whether the anger building in the chest is proportionate, whether the person who said the careless thing meant it as carelessness or as something worse, whether the situation calls for a response at all." When it's depleted, that internal pause shortens, sometimes disappears. The subcortical response moves forward because nothing stopped it in time. There's a specific prefrontal region, the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, that has been consistently implicated in response inhibition, in the capacity to suppress a prepared action. Studies using transcranial magnetic stimulation to temporarily disrupt this region produce measurable increases in impulsive responding. It's a small region, but the effect of its absence is not small. What it does when it's functioning well is introduce a gap between impulse and expression, a fraction of a second, sometimes more, a gap in which something else can happen, a reconsideration, a recalibration, the choosing of a different response than the one that was already loading. That gap is where regulation lives, not in some abstract self-improvement sense. Literally, the gap is a neural interval, a window of cortical processing that sits between the subcortical signal and the behavioral output. When the prefrontal cortex is depleted, the gap narrows, the window closes faster, the anger moves into expression before the checking had time to run. This is not a character failure. It is a tired brain doing what tired brains do. By this point in the night, the prefrontal cortex has been working since you woke up, managing the morning's small irritations, navigating the social calculations of whatever the day required, suppressing responses that would have been appropriate and true but poorly timed, maintaining the particular effortful coherence that adult life in social environments demands more or less continuously, without acknowledgement, without rest breaks, without anyone noticing that the whole thing cost something real. And then whatever happened today happened. The thing that was harder than the ordinary things, the cortisol rose, the amygdala flagged it. The prefrontal cortex moved in to manage the response, to contextualize, to inhibit, to prevent the full subcortical reaction from becoming visible or spoken or irreversible. It succeeded, probably, or mostly succeeded, but it spent something doing it. What remains now is a brain that is quieter in the regulatory sense. The prefrontal activity is lower than it was. The inhibitory influence over older systems has reduced. This is part of why emotional material can surface more easily in the hours before sleep, not because the feelings are stronger, but because the management of them is weaker. Things that were held neatly in place all day begin to drift loose. Thoughts that were kept in the background move toward the foreground. Feelings that were kept labelled and sorted become slightly less labelled. The prefrontal cortex is not gone. It will recover with sleep, substantially and measurably. Slow-wave sleep in particular appears to restore prefrontal function in ways that partial or disrupted sleep does not. The recovery is biological, not motivational. It doesn't require effort. It requires only the sustained rest that the body is now beginning to move toward. The regulation will return, but right now it is quiet, and the body is simply what it is, without the careful management of what it appears to be, which is, in its own way, somewhere in your body right now, in the lining of a blood vessel, or the tissue of the gut, or a lymph node doing its quiet work, a cell is releasing a small protein into the fluid around it. Not because of an infection, not because anything broke, because the nervous system sent a signal hours ago or days ago that the system is under load, and the immune system, which listens to the nervous system more carefully than most people realize, responded. It responded the way it always responds to that signal, with mild, sustained, entirely invisible inflammation. The relationship between psychological stress and immune function has been studied seriously since at least the 1980s, when researchers began measuring immune cell counts and activity in people under chronic stress and finding them consistently altered. What emerged over the following decades was a picture considerably more complex than simple immunosuppression. Acute stress can temporarily enhance certain immune responses. A short burst of sympathetic activation mobilizes natural killer cells and shifts immune resources toward tissues most likely to need them if the threat is physical. The body prepares for injury when it prepares for danger. Chronic stress does something different. Chronic stress, sustained over weeks or months, produces a pattern of low-grade systemic inflammation alongside reduced responsiveness in certain targeted immune functions. The two things coexist. The body is simultaneously inflamed and less capable of mounting specific defenses. It's an expensive state, and it's running in many people most of the time. The signaling molecules involved are called cytokines, small proteins released by immune cells and other tissues that coordinate the inflammatory response. Interleukin-6, usually written as IL-6, rises under psychological stress. So does tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF-alpha, and C-reactive protein CRP, which the liver produces in response to circulating cytokines and which is used clinically as a general marker of systemic inflammation. These are not exotic. They are ordinary immune molecules doing ordinary immune things. The unusual part is what's triggering them, not a pathogen, not damaged tissue, a feeling, or, more precisely, the physiological cascade that an unprocessed feeling sets in motion. The nervous system communicates with the immune system through multiple pathways. Sympathetic nerve fibers innervate lymphoid tissue directly. Norepinephrine receptors sit on the surface of immune cells, and the glucocorticoids released during HPA axis activation have broad immunomodulatory effects. The immune system is not sealed off from emotional experience. It is, in a fairly direct sense, downstream of it. What I find quietly strange about this, and I've been sitting with it long enough that the strangeness hasn't entirely worn off, is the directionality. We tend to think of the emotional experience as something that happens in the mind and then, in dramatic cases, affects the body. The immune finding reverses this somewhat. The body isn't waiting for drama, it's responding to the ordinary accumulated day-by-day chemistry of emotional states that were held rather than processed, suppressed rather than expressed, stored as physiological tension in tissue rather than moved through and released. The inflammation doesn't require a breakdown, it just requires a Tuesday that went badly and wasn't talked about, and then a Wednesday, and then a Thursday. There's a study I return to occasionally involving bereaved individuals measured in the months following significant loss, showing elevated inflammatory markers compared to matched controls, not because grief is pathological, but because grief sustained without social support, grief that sits in the body without adequate processing, maintains a stress response state that the immune system faithfully reflects. The cells don't know about the loss, they know about the cortisol, they know about the sympathetic tone, they respond to the chemistry, not the story. This is also true of anger that isn't grief yet, of pain held in the shape of something harder. The immune system receives the same signal either way, the HPA axis output, the sympathetic activation, the particular hormonal environment of a body that has been defending itself for a while. IL-6 doesn't distinguish between the original feeling and its replacement, it just measures the load. The cells doing this work are small in a way that's worth pausing on. A lymphocyte, one of the primary immune cells involved in these responses, is roughly 7 to 12 micrometers in diameter. A micrometer is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. You have somewhere between 1 and 3 trillion of them circulating in your blood and lymph at any given moment, each one a discrete object with a membrane and a nucleus and a specific chemical identity, each one receiving signals and releasing signals and responding to the molecular environment around it with a precision that no technology we've built has come close to matching. And right now, tonight, some of them are quieting. Not because anything dramatic happened, because the environment changed, because the cortisol is lower than it was, because the sympathetic activation that was running this afternoon has reduced. The cytokine profile of the blood is shifting slowly towards something less aroused. The inflammation doesn't drop in an hour. It's not that fast. But the signal driving it is softening. There's something almost companionable about imagining this. The immune system doing its patient below-awareness work while you lie here. Not fixing anything, not solving anything, just adjusting its chemistry in response to what the nervous system is now telling it, which is something closer to safe than it was at 4 o'clock. The body never asked you whether it should respond to what today carried. It just did, and now, just as quietly, without asking, it's beginning to stand down. There is a part of the nervous system that learned something a long time ago and has not been given adequate reason to unlearn it. Not a part you can point to exactly, more a pattern, a conditioned circuit that fires when particular signals arrive. Signals that were once genuinely associated with something that required bracing. The pattern was useful. It was built in response to a real environment. And then the environment changed, or the person left it, or time passed in the way that time passes, and the pattern kept firing anyway, because patterns don't receive memos about changed circumstances. They receive cues. And if the cues still arrive, the pattern still runs. You probably know this feeling. The disproportionate spike, the too fast anger in a situation that is, by any reasonable measure, safe. The tightening that arrives before thought does in a particular tone of voice or a particular quality of silence. The body reacting as if the past were present, because at the level of the nervous system, in a specific and literal sense, it still is. Fear conditioning, the process by which a neutral stimulus becomes associated with the threat response through repeated pairing, is one of the most robust and well-studied phenomena in all of behavioral neuroscience. It works like this in the simplest version. A stimulus that initially produces no particular response is repeatedly presented alongside something aversive. Over time, the neutral stimulus alone, without the aversive thing, begins to elicit the same physiological response that the aversive thing did. Heart rate increases, the amygdala activates, the body prepares. The association is stored in the lateral nucleus of the amygdala through long-term potentiation, the same synaptic mechanism underlying most forms of learning, in which repeated coactivation of neurons strengthens the connection between them. The neurons that fire together, as the saying goes, wire together. It's a durable connection. In some contexts, it's nearly permanent. What this means, practically, is that a conditioned threat response doesn't require the original threat to still exist. It requires only the presence of the associated cue, a tone of voice, a particular emotional atmosphere, the felt quality of a conversation beginning to tilt in a familiar direction. The amygdala pattern matches. The match doesn't have to be perfect, it has to be close enough. And then the body braces. The part that gets complicated, the part I find myself turning over slowly whenever I think about it, is that the bracing isn't wrong exactly. It was trained by something real. Whatever built the pattern, built it for a reason. The sentinel was posted because there was something worth watching for. The anger that rises so quickly in certain situations was once, in some prior context, a genuinely adaptive response. It protected something. It kept the person functional in an environment that would have cost them more if they'd remained soft. The nervous system did its job. It did its job so well that it kept doing it after the job was over. Extinction, the process by which conditioned fear responses diminish, is possible. This is well established. When the conditioned stimulus is repeatedly presented without the original aversive consequence, the response gradually weakens. New learning occurs, mediated largely by the prefrontal cortex, acting on the amygdala, producing what researchers call an extinction memory that competes with the original conditioning. But extinction is not erasure. This is the part that deserves to be said plainly. The original conditioned association remains in the amygdala even after extinction learning has occurred. What changes is not the circuit, but the balance of competing circuits. The extinction memory, stored partly in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, can suppress the conditioned response under certain conditions, but the suppression is context-dependent. Under stress, under sleep deprivation, under conditions that resemble, even loosely, the original threat environment, the original pattern reasserts. The sentinel comes back to its post. Not because something is wrong with the nervous system, because this is what the nervous system does. It keeps the original learning available, because the environment might change back, and it would rather have the old pattern accessible than risk being caught without it. Notice, if you're willing, where in the body the bracing lives right now. Not a dramatic scan, just a quiet noticing. The shoulders, maybe, a residual holding that hasn't fully released. The chest, with its tendency to stay slightly elevated, slightly defended, even in rooms where nothing is coming. The hands, which may have uncurled somewhat since you lay down, but might still carry a trace of their daytime posture. This is the sentinel in tissue. The nervous system's watch maintained in muscle and fascia and proprioceptive tone. The body holding a posture that corresponds to readiness even when readiness isn't needed. It doesn't do this to cause problems. It does it because somewhere in the learning history of this nervous system, being caught unready cost more than the effort of constant preparation. What shifts this, over time, not tonight, not through any act of will, but over the longer arc of a life, is the accumulation of disconfirming experience. Moments in which the cue arrived and nothing bad followed. Relationships in which the thing that was braced against did not occur. Nights like this one, actually. Nights in which the body held its watchful posture and the environment remained quiet. And the sentinel stood at its post and found nothing to report, and gradually, incrementally, filed this information in whatever way nervous systems file the absence of threat. Slowly the threshold shifts. Not all the way, not permanently, the conditioning is too durable for that. But the extinction memory builds layer by layer, each quiet night adding a little weight to the side of the scale that says this particular environment is no longer what it was. The brain updates reluctantly, conservatively, with enormous caution. But it does update. The part of you still bracing is not a flaw you need to address before you can rest. It is a very old, very loyal piece of biology doing exactly what it was built to do. It learned something. It kept the lesson. It is still here, watching in a room where there is, right now, nothing to watch for. The sentinel doesn't need to be dismissed. It just needs the night to stay quiet long enough that even it gradually begins to stand down. Something changes in the breath first. Before anything else shifts, before the chest loosens or the hands uncurl or whatever was held in the jaw finally lets go, the breath changes. It moves lower. The diaphragm, which may have been doing a partial chest-restricted version of its job for hours, suddenly drops further on the inhale, and the exhale that follows is longer than the one before it. Not because anything was decided. The body found a gap in the load and moved into it. This is where release begins, not in the mind, in the mechanics of breathing. The diaphragm is a dome-shaped sheet of muscle separating the thoracic and abdominal cavities, and its full uninhibited movement is one of the first things the body sacrifices under sustained emotional stress. The tension that accumulates in the thoracic region, the bracing described in earlier chapters, the held quality in the chest and the intercostal muscles, restricts the diaphragm's descent. The breath becomes shallower without the person noticing the shallowing, because it happens gradually and because the body compensates with increased respiratory rate. You breathe more often, less deeply. The chemistry adjusts to keep oxygen levels acceptable. When the tension eases, the diaphragm remembers what it can do. The breath deepens, one long exhale, then another. And the nervous system, which has been receiving shallow breath signals for hours, signals that read as mild physiological stress, receives something different. Longer exhales specifically activate the parasympathetic branch through the respiratory cardiac coupling that sits in the brainstem. The heart rate slows fractionally with each extended exhale. The body reads its own breathing and updates its estimate of the situation. The estimate drops towards safe. Tears, when they come, are not what most people think they are. Or rather, they are that, and also considerably more specific. There are 3 types of tears produced by the lacrimal glands. Basal tears, which keep the eye surface continuously lubricated, reflex tears, which flush irritants, and emotional tears, which have a measurably different chemical composition than either of the other 2. Emotional tears contain higher concentrations of certain proteins, including prolactin, which, as we touched on earlier, rises under emotional suppression and sustained stress. They contain adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, one of the signaling molecules in the HPA axis cascade. They contain leucine-enkephalin, an endogenous opioid. The body, when it produces emotional tears, is not simply expressing a feeling. It is excreting specific stress-related biochemicals through the lacrimal duct. It is, in a literal and rather extraordinary sense, removing them from the system. This is the part I find hardest to describe without it sounding more poetic than it is, because the actual mechanism is genuinely strange. The body accumulates chemical markers of sustained stress, cortisol, ACTH, prolactin, and when certain thresholds are crossed, and when the environment is safe enough for the suppression infrastructure to lower, one of the routes the body uses to reduce the load is to produce emotional tears. Not always, not in everyone. The lacrimal system is modulated by the autonomic nervous system. An individual variation in tearing threshold is real and significant. Some people cry easily, others rarely. Neither is a better version of release, and the body has other routes, and it uses whichever routes are available and open. But when tears do come, they carry something out. The weight of that isn't metaphorical. Cardiac rate during genuine emotional release follows a pattern that takes some researchers by surprise because it doesn't simply drop. It often rises slightly first, a brief activation as the suppression infrastructure releases its hold and the underlying emotional state becomes temporarily more present rather than less. The feeling surfaces before it settles. There's a moment sometimes of more before less, more aware of the grief, more aware of the chest's tightness, more aware of whatever was underneath the anger. And then, following that brief intensification, the parasympathetic shift. Heart rate falls, not dramatically, but measurably, genuinely lower than the elevated baseline that was running during the hours of holding. The body exhales in its own way, Muscles that have been holding release in a specific order that depends on which systems were most activated. The muscles of the face, the corrugator supercilii, the orbicularis oculi, the muscles around the mouth that were pulled taut without expression, these tend to release early because they're closely coupled to emotional state through the facial feedback system and through the direct neural pathways from limbic structures to facial motor nuclei. The shoulders come after. The long-held bracing in the trapezius and the deep cervical muscles, which were maintaining a postural readiness that the situation no longer requires. These release more slowly because they are deeper in the postural system and because the postural system updates with more inertia than the facial system does. Then the hands. Then sometimes a warmth in the chest that isn't quite an emotion and isn't quite a physical sensation but sits at the border of both. The body was always preparing for this. Throughout everything that today held, the suppression, the rerouting, the ancient logic of not collapsing, the cortisol running its quiet campaign, the amygdala pattern matching against old threats, beneath all of that, the physiological conditions for release were accumulating. The body builds toward it. The parasympathetic system doesn't stop trying to reassert just because the sympathetic system has the upper hand for a while. It keeps offering, keeps finding small gaps, keeps doing what it does when given even a little room. The room is here now. The night is quiet. The load is lower than it was. The architecture of defense has reduced its activation, not completely, but enough. Enough that the machinery of release, which was always there, begins to run. Breath, cardiac rate, muscle tone, the chemistry shifting in the blood. Something opens. The opening is slow and unremarkable from the outside. From the inside, it feels like weight setting downs. A body that has spent the day as armor does not immediately know how to be soft. This isn't a failure. It's biology. The transition from the defended state, sympathetic activation, elevated norepinephrine, the particular vigilant tone that runs through muscles and breathing and cardiac rhythm when the nervous system believes it is being watched for threats, to the state that allows genuine sleep is not a switch. It's a negotiation, and it takes time, and the body conducts it without your involvement in the same slow, patient way it conducts everything else that matters. The armor was real, the weight of it was real, and putting down something real takes a moment. Adenosine is accumulating in the brain right now. It has been accumulating since you woke up this morning, a metabolic byproduct of neural activity, building steadily in the extracellular space of the basal forebrain and other regions, binding to adenosine receptors and producing a progressive increase in sleep pressure that has been growing quietly and without drama for every hour of the day. By this point in the night, the pressure is substantial. The brain is carrying a chemical argument for sleep that has been building since before anything difficult happened today, before the cortisol rose, before the amygdala flagged whatever it flagged. The adenosine was already accumulating, patient and indifferent to the day's events, simply doing the chemistry of time passing. It doesn't know about the anger. It doesn't know about the grief underneath it. It knows only that the neurons have been working for a long time and the debt needs paying. The structure that initiates sleep, the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, a small cluster of neurons in the anterior hypothalamus, works through mutual inhibition with the arousal systems. The arousal systems of the brain are multiple. The locus coeruleus releases norepinephrine. The dorsal raphe releases serotonin. The tuberomammillary nucleus releases histamine. The orexin neurons of the lateral hypothalamus provide a stabilizing excitatory signal that keeps the whole arousal network coherent and awake. When the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus activates, it releases inhibitory neurotransmitters, primarily GABA and galanin, onto all of these systems simultaneously. They quiet, not all at once, not evenly. The locus coeruleus, which is the primary source of norepinephrine and which has been running at elevated activity throughout a stressful day, begins to reduce its firing rate. The norepinephrine that was keeping the prefrontal cortex alert, keeping the threat detection systems primed, keeping the body on a low background hum of readiness, it begins to fall. The arousal network loses coherence. The orexin signal, which stabilizes wakefulness, weakens. The switch tips. What this feels like from the inside, if it feels like anything, is a loosening of the particular vigilant quality that a difficult day leaves behind. The thoughts that were cycling, returning to the argument or the silence or whatever it was, begin to lose their grip slightly. Not resolved, not gone, just less instant, the way a sound becomes less distinct as you move away from it without the sound itself changing. The body's surface cools a little as peripheral blood vessels dilate. Core body temperature drops in the early stages of sleep onset, a process regulated by the preoptic hypothalamus, and this drop is part of what the brain reads as the signal to increase sleep pressure. The hands, if you notice them, may feel slightly warmer than the room. The core is redirecting heat outward. Getting ready. This is the body doing something it has done every night of your life without being asked. The armor metaphor, the idea that anger is something the body wears over more vulnerable biology. It doesn't require a resolution to come off. That's the part worth knowing. You don't need to have understood the grief today, or named it, or found the right person to tell it to. The body is not waiting for the psychological work to be completed before it allows sleep. Sleep is not a reward for having processed things correctly. It's a biological necessity that arrives on its own schedule, driven by adenosine and circadian rhythm and the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus doing its slow patient work, regardless of whether the day made sense. The armor comes off not because you decided to take it off. It comes off because the norepinephrine is falling and the muscles don't have the metabolic resources to maintain their defensive tone, and the brain is tipping toward a state in which the threat monitoring networks are, for a few hours, blessedly offline. The body will keep the day's record, we established that. But it keeps the record somewhere you won't be for a while. There is a quality to the body right now that is different from an hour ago. The chest moves differently. The breath, which earlier today was doing its shallow compensatory work, has found its way down again, the diaphragm fuller on the inhale, the exhale longer, the pause between them a little less tense. The jaw, which held so much of the day, is probably not fully released, but it is softer than it was. The hands are open, or nearly open, which is not a small thing for a body that spent the day clenching. The locus coeruleus is quieting. Right now, as you read this or hear this or drift somewhere between the two, the norepinephrine that kept the threat system sharp and the vigilance sustained is declining in the synaptic space. The brain is receiving less instruction to remain alert. The arousal network is losing its argument with the sleep network. Slowly, the way all biological arguments are lost, not in a moment, but over time by degrees, one neuron at a time releasing its hold. The armor was heavy. You've been wearing it for a long time. Some nights the putting down is barely noticeable. Other nights after days like this one, days that required the body to maintain its defensive texture for hours without relief. The release has a particular quality to it, a depth, the muscles letting go of something they had been holding since morning, the chemistry completing a cycle it started before you were aware it had started. The body was always going to arrive here, at this weight, this breath, this specific temperature in this specific room. It worked all day to keep you upright and defended and functional, and it is now, without announcement, without requiring anything of you, beginning the process it always begins when the light goes and the day ends, and the adenosine has finally made its case. It doesn't need the anger to be resolved. It doesn't need the grief to have surfaced. It only needs the dark, the quiet, the particular stillness of a body that has finally for tonight run out of things it needs to brace against.